Okay, now we're beginning our presentation. Let me get ready here. Start from the beginning. Okay, again, this is asarImhotep with the Madu Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. And here I'm on Sonetter TV to discuss part one of my presentation that will fully be presented on August the 2nd in New York and Harlem for the evolution versus mythology debate. So as I explained previously, in this particular presentation, I want to address a few definitions that I wouldn't have had time to present given the time scale or time frame given to us on the panel on August the 2nd. So the title of this presentation is The African Origin of the Words Myth and Science, a Linguistic Assessment. So this is going to be a linguistic study that we're going to do here. So it may be a little tedious at times, but I hope that you can follow. Again, this is the kind of work we do. Again, I want to address this issue that science is a European thing and that there's a such thing as European science. We want to address this head on, and in science or in the various fields of science or scientific inquiries, we like to properly define things so that everyone is on the same page. And so what we're going to go do now is properly define what a myth is and what science is and what it entails, and to show you the African origins of these particular terms. I will later on August the 2nd show how, for example, the ancient Egyptian conceptualization and methodology in terms of science is still going on today in the modern world. And so to argue that there's a such thing as white science would be to neglect the African origins of these processes and these conceptualizations. And we will see, I'll just give a firm foundation for that discussion. So make sure you're in the place to be on August 2nd in New York with Sonetter Studios and the wonderful panel that has been put together to properly analyze and discuss this topic within the African and Black world community as it regards mythology versus evolution, or evolution versus intelligent design. So let's get started. Before we get properly into our discussion, I want to unshamefully plug my latest book. It's titled "Where is the Love? How Language Can Reorient Us Back to Love's Purpose." I'm not just promoting this book for the sake of promotion. I want to give the audience a foundation for what it is that I'm about to discuss. And so the words myth and the word science, of course, comes to us in English. And so in science, we have to lay the grounds for why we are able to move forward on a certain experiment. So what gives me the grounds to argue that the words science and the words myth come from African languages, and that to better understand these terms in Indo-European languages, we must come to Africa? Well, this is the text where I make my case and I have that discussion. And so the first chapter especially is dedicated to that, laying that foundation. So if you want to know and some other resources for being able to argue, for example, that the Indo-European languages come out of African languages, then I highly recommend my book, even though the concept of love, isn't really the focus of this particular discussion. Again, remember that the first chapter, the first and second chapter, to be exact, are dedicated to laying down that foundation for the Indo-European languages coming out of African languages. And this would partially explain why a lot of African terms still survive in these language groups, and how we're utilizing or we're using African words in this modern setting, even though they are divorced from their African context. So in order to purchase the book, you can visit my website and get it from me directly at asarImhotep.com, or you can go to Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble. Either way it goes. Those are the online places that you can get it. And I'll have some copies on August the 2nd. So moving forward, I want to explain some phonetic a phonetic reality that we're going to come across in this particular discussion. And so for those of you who are familiar with the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, these are two graphic sounds or graphemes that represent some sounds in the African languages, or specifically in ancient Egyptian, which we call Chikam for Kemet, the language of Kemet. So we call it Chikam. This arm glyph here is kind of a glottal type sound. Originally comes from an H, and I reconstructed to a KH followed by a mid vowel, the I. And so so this is a K sound in the literature on ancient Egyptian phonology. They'll usually render this kind of like an A or ah, like a glottal stop. And then you can see these variations according to these different authors on the pronunciation of this sound. But what's more important for us in this discussion is this actual hieroglyph right here. And so this is how, we transcribe this sound, here, but it is a nasalized uvular trill. That means it's a nasalized R. So when you see this little squiggly line over the R, we know that it is nasalized. So it's a simultaneous articulation of an N as in Nancy, or and with the R sound. And so we don't really have this sound in English, but think of this as close to an R sound. Also, there's going to be a number of sound interchanges. And so in the Middle Egyptian language, this J or I sound alternates with that nasalized uvular trill, that R that we saw earlier. That same R, nasalized uvular trill, alternates with the R spoken of, just a regular R. That same sound alternates with N. So remember that it's an N articulated, simultaneously with the R, and sometimes the R is just dropped, and we're left with the N. This sound is a kind of a hard guttural K type sound, a KH type sound. It alternates with another H type sound, which is a soft K type sound. We don't have any of these sounds in English, so it's kind of hard to pronounce. But just understand these graphemes, that this H with this loop under it alternates with this H with this straight line under it. It's going to become very important later on. And also I wanted to highlight here at the bottom in green, specifically that KH, that hard KH sound also alternates with this sh sound. So in the ancient Egyptian literature, when you see someone transcribe this sound here with this kind of like V over the S, this S is not pronounced like Sally. It's a sh, as in Cheryl. And so that represents. And so this with this, and we know that there is an I or Y or E sound after it, because that's what causes the palatalization. So both of these sounds, matter of fact, this sound, and this sound comes from a K sound. So it's from K to these different variations, based on palatalization, from the presence of the closed central vowels, and things of that nature. So, for more info on that, again, look at the Where is the Love book. And so now let's give some examples of some of this sound change that we saw in the green highlighted. So you see in this word, this is how we say Set, the god Set, in ancient Egyptian literature. One of the variations of his name is Setesh, that we see here. So we see this in the final consonant position. Then over here we see that alternation with that H type sound, that soft KH type sound. In both of these are Set. In this dialectical variation, we have Seshem, image, protective images. Then we have Sechem, image, likeness. Same word, dialectical variation. Here we have official inquiry, and here we have the word chen, ask. And so an inquiry is just a question, and so is asking is a question. Both of these are dialectical variations of the same word. This word shinu, cord, rope, net, is the dialectical variant of this word here. So remember that the sh interchanges with h, and that nasalized uvular trill also interchanges with n. So these are the same words meaning cord, spelled differently. And so we have here seshesh, books, written instructions, and it's cognate with this word here, this variant, which has this nasalized uvular trill as a suffix. And so it's seker, sekeru, documents, notes, memos. Sesesh, writing, depiction, record, papyrus, roll, letter, documents. Again, writing, record, depiction. This is zecher, sekeru, right here. These are just different variations. So this is a variation of this word, and both of these variations are variations of this word over here. And last but not least, we have seshir, to utter or to express. Its variation over here is sekeru, ritual, recitations. Again, both are utterances. And so remember that this sh interchanges with this h, and this r also interchanges with this nasalized r, here, which we don't have the same equivalent in English. So keep this in the back of your head as we're discussing our topic today. So now we're going to get into what is mythology. According to Martin Bernal, the word mythos originally meant succession of words with meaning, discourse. Later it was restricted to fiction or myth. So the word myth, comes from a Greek mythos, and it just essentially means a succession of words. It just means words or discourse, utterances. And in terms of the nature of myth, Court informs us that a myth is thus a representation of reality, which, though fantastic, claims to be accurate. So unlike fables, myths are grounded in reality, a human perception of a series of events that one seeks to interpret, but it may not be wholly accurate. And it's this issue of accuracy that separates a myth from science, because science seeks to be accurate in its explanations, while myth just seeks to explain without necessarily leaning towards accuracy. But we'll see how it plays out later on in our discourse. And so now, from Agdibole, in terms of the nature of myth, he says that the myth is prehistoric culture's attempt at answering the most perplexing questions posed by the supernatural and natural in creation. As I stated earlier, people get it confused with fables, but myths, again, are rooted in reality, whereas fables are not. And so the myth will address something that, either happened socially or happen in nature, but it's basically a layman's theory, of how the world in the environment or the social world operates. And then fables are, of course, just fantasies that have no grounding in reality. But both of them attempt to kind of bring about a lesson, for human beings to learn. And so in a myth, what's important is the underlying lesson that the creator of the myth is trying to pose for the public to evaluate. And so it's not an issue about whether it's accurate or not. Is, did you get the message? What kind of lesson are they're trying to convey that you can learn to help your life? That's what essentially what a myth is. These oral traditions, to convey these so-called truths of reality. And so now we're going to get into the linguistics of the word myth. And so according to the online etymological dictionary, the word myth in English comes from myth in the French language, and directly from modern Latin mythos, from Greek mythos. Again, as Bernal stated, I'll get a little bit more elaborate here in terms of speech, thought, story, myth, anything delivered by word of mouth. And this is one of the things I wanted to highlight. Its origin is unknown, which means that it has no origin in the Proto-Indo-European languages. And so this is ripe for borrowing in terms of the Greek language. So the idea of a myth comes out of, some other language, or it's possibly, but We'll get into this into the next slide. So there was a Coptologist in 1953 by the name of P.V. Jernstein. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he proposed that the Greek mythos derived from the Egyptian medu, words or discourse. And I add here, the Greek consonants, M and TH, deriving from the Egyptian MD. And so we can see the Egyptian or Chikam at the top here, medu, MDW, oracular utterances, the word myth, MTH. So this TH corresponds with this D, oracular utterances. And this is coming from the Yoruba language. So we say Odu. And for those who are familiar with Ifa tradition, you know that when we go to the mat or we consult Ifa, we drop Odus, which are just signs associated with oracular utterances, verses that are associated with certain signs. They're just myths. And so in the Yoruba language, this M is a prefix in the Medu Neter and in equivalents across Africa. And it is dropped in the Yoruba language. This is an M prefix of abstraction. It gives words an abstract quality. And so it is dropped in the Yoruba. So they just say Odu. Whereas in Egyptian is, Modu. And they say myth, or Medu or myth, as far as this is concerned. And so here are some cognates of the word Medu from, the ancient Egyptian and some other African languages. So we see in the Kwame language, Ma'ad, to say, Afar language, Mada, speech, Teda language, Meta, to speak, Medi, speech. So we see this T and D interchange. They're allophones of each other here. And so Medi, speech again. In the Fulani language, for full day, Meda or Met, to speak. Again, the Yoruba language, Odu, oracular utterances, speech. In the Setswana language, Matoto, conversation. All of these are in the same semantic field. They have to deal with utterances coming out of the mouth. So, and so remember that the word myth, means speech, thought, story, myth, anything delivered by word of mouth, of unknown origin. And so we can see how this became a borrowing from the ancient Egyptians. And so that word medu itself, remember that the M is a prefix. It comes from it's a variant of another word in the Egyptian language, which is just simply represented as R. The Egyptians did not write out their vowels. So it's word, mouth, speech. RW, the plural utterances. In the Yoruba language, again, oro, word, speech, mouth. Oro, roar. And then the RD, equivalent like we see in Egyptian, Ede, language. In Chiluba Bantu is Ila, utterance, command, word. Deyi, speech, command, divine law. And then from there, from this root Ila, or Ar or Oro, we have Rau, Aru, Bu, or Bualu, which means word, history, science, knowledge, discipline. And so you can say this in Chiluba, Bualu, Ma'aru, Ma'adu, Ma'alu. These are all variants of this root here. And so it comes to mean word, history, science, knowledge, discipline. So for instance, when we're saying Medu Neter, it's not simply God's words or divine words. It is the science, the knowledge, or the discipline of nature. That's all a Neter is. It's a representation of the forces of nature. And so the African languages allow us to get clarity. And from this history or word utterances where you get the concept of myth. And so that's the ancient way of conveying knowledge to the future, is through myths, through utterances, oral traditions around the campfire. So let's continue. And so on the nature of myth, Agdebolo informs us that myths are therefore hypotheses. They are constructed to offer explanations of phenomena. They are always literary hypotheses, not scientific hypotheses. So there's a difference. Even though we can use the word Bwalu or Malu to mean science, there's a fundamental difference between science and myth. Even though as we'll see later on, there is some overlap in conceptualization. But it is not scientific hypotheses. They are poetic in style, hence the prevalence of personification of abstractions. In mythology, every abstract principle becomes an animal, a totemic ancestor, a human being, a human ancestor, or a divine being, a divine ancestor. And so keeping this in mind, especially when we start talking about the myths of the Bible, how this is all going to play out and why we cannot consider the Bible or the Quran, scientific or historical texts, because they're myths, they're poetic, even though they may be grounded in a certain reality. It is not necessarily meant to be accurate. It's just simply their hypotheses of how phenomena came to be. But these are hypotheses. The difference between scientific hypotheses is that they test them. And so there's no testing in mythology. You just come up with a hypothesis and then you roll with it. And so that's what the biblical text has done. That's what the Quranic text has done. They created myths, hypotheses for how the world came into being, how certain situations and relationships between communities came to be. And then they just roll with it without any kind of testing and eliminating alternative, possibilities. And so I even argue that the word method possibly comes from the word medu. And this is something that is ongoing in terms of an investigation, and I'll tell you why. But the word medu, again, means word, speech, or matter. It also means the formation of abstraction, but it also equals method. And so this is why this dialectical variation also deals with science, as we discussed earlier, which we see here in Chiluba. So this malu, maadu, bwalu, all this means science, knowledge, discipline. The word science means to know. And so in the African context, myth was also associated with science because it dealt with a methodology. This is what the word medu means. And so when we're talking about medu, it's a science, the discipline, of nature. And it's not just fantastical stories. And so this grounds us properly in the correct understanding of how the ancient Egyptians were rolling, even though they creatively and poetically was personifying certain concepts in nature. They were based in reality and by way of proper methodology. Even the word medut itself means method. And so the word method, according to the online etymological dictionary, they argue comes from Greek meta, after, and hodos, a traveling way. So this would be different here, but I think this is ultimately folk etymology, because I cannot find where they can substantiate this. This is more so a hypothesis. And so as we spoke of earlier, the D sound corresponds to Greek th. But the question for all the linguists who are listening will be, can we find correspondences, and especially in the final position, of Egyptian T corresponding with Greek D? And so that's where the ongoing investigation. But this is my hypothesis right now, that even the word method, so essential to science, comes out of Egypt by way of medut that we see here in terms of method. And so, there's stages where we have to take to ensure that it's not chance coincidence in terms of chance lookalikes. And so I'm saying that this is my hypothesis for right now. And so as a regard to sound correspondences that I mentioned earlier, Bernal informs us that the possible, and just as an example, in terms of the correspondence between Egyptian D and Greek TH, that a possible Egyptian etymology for tholos is duat, in the sense another chamber or tomb. Apart from the slight semantic distance, however, no correspondence in terms of initial D or TH can be confirmed, although a medial one can be confirmed. In other words, Egyptian D and Greek TH, in the initial consonant position, we cannot find correspondences. But in middle, like we saw in the word medu, it's in the middle of a word, a consonant and a vowel. It corresponds with th, just like what we see here. And so going back, this is reaffirmed by Dr. Theophilo Wabinga in his article on the correspondences between the Yoruba language and ancient Egyptian. He says that the Latin D corresponds to Greek th, Latin condere, Greek syntene, to put together, Latin viduos, Greek ethios, unmarried. Latin D corresponds to Greek th only in the interior of a word, between vowels and after n. So just like how D corresponds to th in the medial position with ancient Egyptian, it does the same thing with Latin. And so again, the issue is going to be that final T and D correspondence. But again, one of the ways that we could confirm the idea of medu dealing with method in science is, looking at other African languages. So we're looking at the sister language of the Yoruba language, and that is the Igbo language. So Igbo and the Yoruba share a common ancestor. And so in that language, how they have Odu in terms of the oracular utterances and things of this nature, the Igbo have Otu, Etu, way, manner, method, procedure, Atu, Atumatu, advice, instruction, example, plan, sign, symbol, symbology. Odu, advice, admonishment, counsel, soothing words. Duo or dua, counseling, soothing, advising. This is very informative because when you actually study a myth is really just a collective way or a creative way to give advice to the collective population. It's instructions on how to be, it's counseling basically for the public. It's symbology. It's not precision. It's not concerned with accuracy, but it's concerned with this. And so anybody who has been to a Babalawo and gotten a reading from a Babalawo, or just a practitioner who is well versed in the Ifa oracle, the myths that they give you, the Odus, are what ultimately is on advice on how to move forward, instructions based on similar circumstances in the past. And so that's why that variation of in Chiluba Bantu word history is important to that word, because that's what it deals with, is history. Based on history, how can we move forward in a way that is mutually beneficial, to everyone involved in this situation? And so that's what a myth is. It's just a way to explain reality in a way that it is instructive, and we get counseling, saying from it. We get advice from it on how to move forward and to live our lives to the fullest. And so I wanted to bring up this particular text or this particular citation from an African-American astro-theoretical physicist by the name of Sylvester James Gates Jr. And the way that we deal with myth in Africa is kind of the same way that we deal with, science to this day. And so what he says is something that's very instructive. He says in this particular keynote address, and you can see the YouTube video link at the bottom here, this is what we call vertex normalization in quantum theory. And what it basically says is that the charge that an electron couples to a photon with actually depends on things such as the speed and the spin. The location, much more complicated than the equation we taught our students in high school. You see, we constantly lie when we teach science, but we lie in the service of truth. We tell people that part of the truth that is appropriate for what they have as a background. It would make no sense for me to walk into a high school classroom and try to teach my students relativistic quantum field theory. So I say instead, Coulomb's law is the end of the story, even though I know that it is not the complete accurate story, but it's good enough for the audience. So when you talk to a scientist, you need to be very careful if you're not a scientist, because you need to know what the scientist is assuming about what you know, because that influences what we will tell you. And so this is very instructive, because this is very ancient in terms of application. This is how myths are born often. And so there's a certain level of information that is revealed to the scientists of that community, but trying to explain these concepts to the layperson can become taxing. And so what they'll do is not necessarily that they will lie, but they'll basically lie, give you summaries that'll satisfy your palate at that level of understanding. And so that's where myths come in. Myths is for the layman, the person who is not going to necessarily spend long hours studying in depth the scientific principles which may be brought about in the myth. And so this is very instructive, and we got to keep this in mind. And so now we're going to get on to what is science. And so to define science by the way of the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine, The use of evidence to construct testable explanations and predictions of natural phenomena, as well as the knowledge generated through this process. Again, for science, what separates it from a myth is that the ideas that they want to test the explanations for accuracy, to be able to falsify or confirm a hypothesis, and also to make predictions of the natural world, the natural phenomena. Whereas a myth is not concerned with that necessarily. It's only an attempt to explain, a reality, but not necessarily accurately, because it's not concerned with making predictions or testing the explanations. And since you can't test myths, you cannot equate myths in the modern sense outside of the African context with science. Whereas you can do this in Africa, but they overlap in the African context. Whereas outside, where it was a borrowing of the term and concept, it has taken on a whole new life. So whether we're talking about the myths in, the Hebrew tradition or the Indo-European or even other African groups, myth is separated from science because, again, science is concerned with predictions. And this is going to be very key and critical when we have our conversation on August the 2nd. So keep this in mind, and then, come back on August the 2nd for my presentation, and I'll show you how the ancient Egyptians were concerned with predictions and testing, calculating in a very modern sense. And so anyone who is anti-science and anyone who's anti-evolution is anti-African. And I will demonstrate this on August the 2nd. And so, because I will even prove that the word evolution itself comes out of Africa and, has its cognate in Egyptian. And so that'll be discussed on the 2nd. But again, this is what we mean by science in the modern sense. And so now let's get to the actual etymology of science. The word science means what is known or knowledge of something, acquired by study, information. Also, assurance of knowledge, certitude, certainty. From Old French, science, knowledge, learning, application, corpus of human knowledge. From Latin, scientia, knowledge, a knowing, expertness. From science, genitive of scientis, intelligent, skilled. Present participle of scire, to know, probably originally to separate one thing from another, to distinguish. And so again, a myth tries to summarize, a science tries to distinguish, to eliminate possibilities so you can only get at the truth, the accurate, a more accurate assessment. So accuracy is at the heart of knowing in a very scientific way. And so it comes from a related word, skindere, means to cut, divide. From Proto-Indo-European, ske, to cut, to split. And so skiden, to split, rend, from Gothic, adian, to divide, separate. So when we're talking about science, we're talking about separating, knowledge, separating the wheat from the chaff, doing the experiments so we can eliminate and cut off all that which is irrelevant to the phenomenon which we're trying to understand. And this word is going to be very key. Keep this word here in mind. Ske, to cut, to split. SK is the consonant root, and then this vowel right here. So SK here. So now let's move forward. And so continuing along that path, it's also associated with book learning, a particular branch of knowledge or learning, skillfulness, cleverness, craftiness, experimental knowledge, a skill, a handicraft, a trade. Especially that gained by a systematic observation or experiment or reasoning. In the modern restricted sense of a body of regular or methodical observations or propositions concerning a particular subject or speculation. Well, I highlighted these words for a reason. Book learning, a particular branch of knowledge of learning, skillfulness, cleverness, experimental knowledge, a skill, a handicraft, a trade. This is going to be very important. And re-emphasize this. Pause this and look over this. And pay attention in the next few slides when we start examining the African cognates. And so Jean-Claude Mboli in his text, The Origin of African Language, also reconstructed this root and noticed that there's 2 variations of this root. It's actually 3 variations of this root, and we'll see in a moment. But this variation here, S key, remember that ske, to cut. There's an S SKER variant. And then there's a variant cur to cut without the S prefix. This S prefix is a causative prefix, meaning it means to cause to cut, not just cut. And so it's fossilized into the record. So this is where the word science comes from. Sker and ker, skel, kel, to cut. And so this is from Mboli's text. Mallory and Adam on the Oxford Introduction to Proto-Indo-European gives these the same thing. Sker, to cut. And they put it in these parentheses here to let you know that this S could be there or not, just like what we see here in Mboli's. And so this is a prefix that was fossilized. In some dialects, it kept this variation. In other dialects, it kept. So we get the word science from this dialect of Indo-European that kept the S, K, and R variant. So remember that SKR consonant, SKL, we see, in this variation right here. Scared, to know. SC, this is a, we call this, the reason why you say a C instead of a K now is because of a process in linguistics called palatalization. When there's a I or a E or sometimes a Y after a K, sometimes that K will turn into values like C or Ch or H, like we see in these variations. So this was the word science is a dialectical variation that is based on palatalization of that K consonant. So SKE turns into SC. And so this variation SCR, this is really SKIE. And again, we see that variation, here in these reconstructions. And so it's a reconstruction, we know, because of the star symbol of it, that you can look at these page numbers and find this term. So here again, the origin of the word science, meaning coming from to cut. And so again, Mallory and Adams, to cut apart, to cut off. The word shear in Greek kiero come from this root, meaning to cut off. Another reconstruction, quer, curt, to cut. But here's where it gets interesting. Ske, a skid, to cut. And it also means the word shit. The word shit in English comes from this same word cut. And so when somebody says you don't know shit, it's kind of like the word shit, because it's to cut off, to branch off, look it up. The word shit comes from the word to cut. And it's the same root that the word science comes from. But notice, because of that I, in this variation it's C, the K turns into C, and in this variation it turns into H. And so here the palatalization is chiati and sec. And so remember I told you there's 3 variations. And so you have the SKR variant, the KR variant, and now you have just the SK because the R suffix has been dropped. And so cut and echo. And so this is the SKL variant, is where we get the word skills from. So when you have skill in something, you have knowledge of something, you have mastery of something. You are cut above the rest. You are able to distinguish, one thing from another. And so this is where these concepts come from in English. And so Mallory and Adams informs us again. They reaffirm what we see in the online etymological dictionary, that even more fundamental root sec, to cut, iskid, cuts off, Latin seco, cut, isecti, dig, cut, seco, cut, also gives us Latin skio, to know, and Hittite, sak, to know. The semantic change from cut to know is not admittedly an obvious one, but it is confirmed by the same change in the history of Keres. Remember that the KR is another variation of it, another enlargement of Ker, above, which we saw earlier, which means cut. And then in the Hittite language, karsmi, as would expect, means to know. So again, this idea of to know, knowledge, science comes from an idea meaning to cut. This is going to be very important, and I'm doing this to stress and re-emphasize, on what is science. And so this word we find in the modern Chiluba Bantu language, but the phonemes are switched. So instead of the SK value, it is now KS. And so it's switched in Chiluba, but cutting, slicing, to cross a path, stop, halt, to cut again, cut into small pieces, chikosa, dikosa, to cut, chikosedi, where one cuts, slice, koseka, break, rupture, be broken, koshi, judicial, to judge. That's fundamentally what it means. Koshi, bukoshi, these are variants of the same word. And so when that I is behind the S, it palatalizes it to she. So bukoshi, koshi, judicial, judgment, the liberty judge to make a decision. It's all built on wiseness, to be able to discern and cut through the BS to get to the heart of a problem. This is what this word means. Mukoshi, one that cuts or slices. You know, the one who decides, a decision maker. In kosela, in kosedi, how to decide. You know, all of these, you know, come from the same word. So the same semantics that we saw in the Indo-European regarding this root, we find in the African languages where it originally came from. Remember, Indo-European languages come out of African languages. They have our fundamental terms. And so here's a reconstruction, a few reconstructions by Mboli, you know, in comparison with Mallory and Adams. So again, queer, to cut, you know, comes from Negro Egyptian reconstruction, Kuuri, split, divide, to break, split, divide. And we can see these in these modern languages. In the Egyptian, remember that this comes from a K. This is a type of K sound, and this is R. So kirit, massacre. And so it's a semantic, you know, or a, how should I say this? An expansion of the theme in terms of being able to cut and slice. So now it's a word for massacre, because when you massacre, of course, you're cutting. You know, back in the day, they didn't have guns; they had swords. So a massacre, you know, is when you have a heap of corpses, especially in a military context, when they was slicing and killing each other with the swords or arrows. And then, you know, the reconstruction here, swiki, the S and K consonant sounds, sek, cut. This is the reconstruction coming from the African languages. And so we have here the cognate variant, you know, chop off limbs in the Egyptian language. So this is how you write that word, sek, to cut, chop off limbs, you know, in Egyptian. In the collagen language, these are the descendants of ancient Egyptians who now live in places like Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Sudan. And so this collagen, this word here is now sak, divide meat, a portion of meat. Sak, branch out, branch off. Sak, cause someone to hurt. So all the same, you know, words here. And so, you know, here, even in the Northwest, according to Mallory and Adams, you know, secure. So it's that SKR root here for axe. And, you know, coming from sec, to cut. Latin securus, secrera, both axes. This is a word for axe in the Indo-European languages. Over here in the SK root, it becomes a lance or a spear, a cutting device in Egyptian. So here's the hieroglyphs for that, you know, word. Now, remember that their word skio, to know, Hittite sach, to know. In Egyptian, remember that we said that the K, this K or KH sound, you know, also interchanges with sh. So this shishir, to know, to be wise. The collagen language keeps the K value from the original, which means to realize, to get to know deeper about something, to have lessons. So sik, this is where we get science from, sikke. Collagen language, to realize, get to know deeper about something. In Egyptian, it was sisher, know, to be wise. And so we can see this, you know, this is the word for science in the ancient Egyptian language. This is how you spell it. And so here's some other variations to confirm our hypotheses. And so again, that root sh, you know, a skith or a sickle, because remember, it means to cut. And so you can see at the end of the hieroglyph here, this knife, letting you know that this word is about cutting of some sort. And the R sound is now switched in the front. Remember I said the I or the J sound and the nasalized uvular trill interchange? This is what we see here, you know, and then we have a variation here to harvest, sickle, and reap, to cut. So we see the person here, the determinative with the sickle. This is what the word here, this is what a sickle looks like right here, harvesting some wheat, you know, again, dealing with cutting. It's the same root, same consonant clusters, same thing. Here's the actual sickle, a sickle skeeth, and to reap, to mow down, you know, all dealing with cutting. And so we see the same variations that we saw in Indo-European, we see it here in the Egyptian language. And so again, that ch sound interchanges with sh. So instead of sech, they say sesh, to cut, linen or papyrus. That same idea of cutting is also the same word for to write or to inscribe, paint, or draw. Remember what I said earlier in terms of writing, knowledge, books, things of that nature. Here's the cognate here in the Egyptian language and where these concepts come from. Remember that writing and books come out of ancient Egypt. So this concept comes out of ancient Egypt. So sesh, again, writing, depiction, a record, a papyrus roll, a letter, or a document. Sesh and secher. Remember, all of these sounds interchange with each other. To write, sesh, writing, depiction, record. These are all the hieroglyphs, variations of this. To write or to inscribe, all coming from a word meaning to cut. So this is what science deals with. It deals with writing treaties, writing scientific treaties. This is what all of this entails. And so here's a different variation. So remember I said that this correlates with the ch sound. So now we're going to see the dialectical variations of the same words. Seker, to write. Zecher, to write, to paint, to work as a scribe. Sesh, secher, as we saw in the previous, to write. All of these are the same word, dialectical variations over time. And so this is the word science. And so, we have even more confirmation of what science is. And so we have seker, the variation of that matter, state, estate. Sekeru, plan, counsel, determination, governance, intentions, guidance, instructions. Sesher, thing, action, method. That's what separates science from myth in terms of methodology. Sasher, work, business, concern, everything, material things, actions. This correlates with here. So this is a dialectical variation of this word here. Secher, matter, estate. Sasher, work, concern, material things, is all dealing with matter and state. And so sasher, the thing or concern. All of this, same word, same variation. But these are just variations of these words here. To take counsel, meditate, consider, to think about, critical thinking. This is what's critical here. This is what separates science from myth. The proper way, in good order. All right, well in order, in good condition, properly. The proper methodology. Remember that this is a variation of this thing, action, method. It's about proper methodology. And so it's not just making up stuff off of a whim. It's a scientific, to be scientific. Remember, this is the word for science. Is to deal with methodology, knowing by way of proper methods, things being well in order, a proper way of doing something. So, we're going to deal with methodology on August the 2nd, and we're going to reaffirm, these findings here in terms of science coming out of ancient Egypt, and how when we talk about science, methodology, proper methodology, that it's not a modern thing. This existed in ancient Egypt. The same words, the same approach, all of this is found in ancient Egypt. And so science was so important to the ancient Egyptians that they personified science as a black woman. Her name, the goddess's name, is Seshet, or Sesherit, if we want to properly pronounce it, or something, close to Sesherit, because remember, the nasalized will trills are now vowel sound. But as you can see, the ancient goddess of wisdom, knowledge, writing. She was seen as a scribe and a record keeper, and her name means she who inscribed. She was a scribe and is credited with, attention here, she's credited with the inventing of writing, because writing comes from carving. They carved in stone first. They carved on wood, bark, staves, and stuff to that nature. And so this is where we get writing from. Even the word write, if you look it up, go to the etymological dictionary, type in write, like to write, your name on a piece of paper. That word write comes from a word meaning to cut. And so she also became identified as the goddess of architecture, astronomy, astrology, building, mathematics, and surveying. These are all professions that rely on expertise in this skills. Remember, skills is the dialectical variant of the word science. It's all the same word, expertise in surveying, mathematics, building, astronomy, architecture, all sciences. These are core sciences of today. And so the ancient Egyptians using this word personifying to address proper methodology on knowing these deep disciplines. And so with that said, remember that the word science means to know. And so here it is. To know, to be wise, to be aware, to be clever. Remember I told you about cleverness. To be skilled, experienced, cleverness. To take counsel, mediate, consider, think about. The healing arts, medicine, pathology, diagnosis. This is science, literally, not figuratively. This is the word for science in ancient Egypt. And this is what it's all about. Knowledge, wisdom, by way of proper methodology. And so in these conversations that I'm seeing a lot of unscientific conversation. Nobody addressing proper methodology for analyzing the information. And so for us in the Kemet camp, being involved in modern science is business as usual for us. We're not adopting anything by Europeans. The word for science is methodology, is conceptualization, is African. It comes out of Africa. These are African words, African conceptualizations. And so this is what needs to be understood, moving forward as it regards this concept of science and mythology. What separates them is methodology, accurate, proper ways of assessing phenomena, and cutting and dividing, cutting the wheat from the chaff, getting rid of the irrelevant information to only get to the more accurate truth. There's no such thing in science as absolute truth. No one in science claims to have absolute truth. They strive towards accuracy. And in order to do that, you have to be able to cut and divide and be able to judge based on proper methods that reveal consistent results, that result in predictions, for the future. That's the difference. And so just kind of repeating here, the idea of sesh being with the writing and scribing and things of that nature. But we're going to end here, and we're going to pick up the conversation in a little bit, and I'll give my ending words. But hopefully, if you need to review this again, rewind this video and go over it again, that the word science itself comes out of Africa, and these are the cognates for it. And so the concept of the scientific method is African in terms of proper methodology, a way of approaching, the understanding of the universe, correcting errors along the way by eliminating errors in analysis. That's what science is. Mythology in the modern sense does not deal with that. They just, take the hypothesis and roll with it, but they're never concerned with the accuracy of the myth, and it doesn't have predictive value, and they never test the myth to see that if it's accurate in its claims. And so you cannot argue that a myth is scientific. And the same thing when it comes to the biblical myths, and the same thing when it comes to the Quranic myths. They're not accurate. They're not science. And so, want to stress that again. And so I'll conclude with this portion of the discussion, and we'll sum it up, quickly in a little bit.